Hi, good evening. Thank you for coming. I know it's tough to get through Pune city traffic, and to be here and share this evening with us is really great. Thank you so much for coming. This evening wouldn't have happened without one of our audience members, Smita Murthy here, who introduced us to Ruby. And it just happened that we could do this, and Ruby said yes. And so thanks to Smita, and of course a huge thank you to Ruby to be here. She's been here just for 2 days, but she's spending this evening with us, sharing her work with us. I'll quickly introduce Ruby. Ruby Lal is a professor of South Asian Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. She holds a D.Phil in Modern History from the University of Oxford and an M.Phil in History from the University of Delhi. She has taught at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in History and Anthropology and served as Associate Director of the Program for the Study of Women, Gender and Sexuality. Her fields of study include feminist history and theory and the question of archive as it relates to writing about Islamic societies in the pre-colonial and colonial world. Her first book, Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World, published in 2005 by Cambridge University Press, won much acclaim, including numerous reviews in major international journals and magazines, such as the New York Review of Books, the Economic and Political Weekly, Review Historique, and the Times Literary Supplement. Her second book, Coming of Age in 19th Century India, The Girl, Child and the Art of Playfulness, published 2013, Cambridge University Press, was reviewed extensively in academic journals and magazines with wider intellectual concerns. Her current creative non-fiction work is a narrative history of Mughal Empress Nur Jahan. It's called Empress, the Astonishing Reign of Nur Jahan. It's going to be out next year, published in New York. So we've been wanting to have historians here for a very long time, South Asian historians, world historians, and it's really nice that we could be here and start off this series of talks, hopefully in history and its relevance in our world today. Thanks, Ruby.
Thank you. Thank you. If you can't hear me, just tell me, because I'm quite used to standing and talking in my classes, so I don't have to sit. And I'm very restless, so I'd much rather stand and move about, but let me try. Let me begin by thanking Khusro Irani, and I just want to say that I'm completely staggered by the space that has been created. I mean, I think it's a marvelous space in a marvelous city. So thank you for the invitation. I'm very grateful to Smita Murthy, my friend. She's been, our connection goes back many, many years. I won't go into the story of how we met, but you know, she's been asking me to come to Pune for a long time, but this is really, you know, the first chance I've had, and not least because my graduate student Sayali Bapat and her mother Vaishali Bapat have been hosting me. I've worked a lot on the Indo-Gangetic belt, essentially northern India, and I've been, you know, as a historian, there are different layers that impress you, and there are marvelous, dense, complicated layers about Pune that are already, you know, striking me in the face. So what a marvelous historic city you live in. You know, it's a similar kind of marvelous figure that I want to talk to you about today. So I'm going to do a combination of things. I'm going to begin by taking you to the autumn of 1619, and then I'll talk more. I won't give you the whole book because I think you should read the book. And I can't give you, I hope I can tantalize you enough to want to pick up the book. But I'm really happy to, you know, take any kinds of questions. There may be questions to do with, you know, the process. I've made a huge departure from academic history to more narrative history. But I keep intact my commitments as a feminist historian. And what is integral here in the story is, you know, why we know her and yet we don't know her. That's really the kind of lurking question. So as I said, let me begin by taking you to 1619 It was autumn, you can see I'm standing already. It was autumn when the days were clear and cool, perfect for travel. The royal cavalcade of Emperor Jahangir and Empress Nur Jahan, his 20th and favorite wife, set out from Agra, the capital of Mughal India, and headed for the Himalayan foothills. The people of Mathura, a popular pilgrimage site along the emperor's route, were anxious for his arrival. For months, a tiger had been attacking villagers and visitors, then disappearing into the forest, evading hunters. No divine intervention seemed to be forthcoming from Krishna and Radha, the Hindu deities worshipped in the Mathura's temples. But the emperor could solve the problem. Killing tigers had long been a royal prerogative. Jahangir, his name meant conqueror of the world in Persian, the language of the court, was the fourth Mughal emperor. A Muslim dynasty, you all know, had been established by invasion early in the 16th century. They were descendants of Central Asian nomads, Genghis Khan and Timur, and they ruled India for over 300 years. So according to one excited observer, the imperial procession included 1,500,000 people, men, women, children, courtiers, soldiers and servants, along with 10,000 elephants and a great deal of artillery. The procession halted near Mathura, and attendants began erecting hundreds of magnificent tents with the haram quarters marked with intricately carved red tents. While the traveling court was still being set up, a group of local huntsmen appeared and begged the emperor to do something about the tiger. Unfortunately, the emperor was obliged to decline. Several years before, Jahangir had taken a vow to give up hunting when he turned 50. After that, he had promised Allah he would injure no living being with his own hands. He was 2 months past that milestone birthday and had recently renewed the vow as an offering on behalf of a favorite 4-year-old grandson traveling with him who suffered from infantile epilepsy. Shooting a tiger was now out of the question for Jahangir. The Empress, however, was prepared to protect her subjects. Beautiful and accomplished, Nur Jahan was the daughter of nobles who fled persecution in Persia. She was also the widow of a court official implicated in a plot against Jahangir, but that didn't stop the emperor from falling hard for her. She was 34 when they met, married, nearly middle-aged in the Mughal world. Since their wedding in 1611, the same year that Shakespeare premiered The Tempest, Nur Jahan, literally light of the world in Persian, the name that her husband gives her, had proved to be a devoted wife, a wise and just queen, a shrewd politician, and an expert markswoman. Her shooting skills were already legendary. A few years earlier, she had amazed her husband and his courtiers by slaying 4 tigers with only 6 shots. So on October 23rd, 1619, Nur Jahan mounted an elephant and settled into the howdah, the elaborate litter on the animal's back holding a musket. The mahout led along the sandy track towards the forest. Nur Jahan accompanied her husband Jahangir on his own elephant, and they were followed by a long line of courtiers, some on superbly ornamented elephants and horses, and others in red and gold jeweled palanquins with silken seats and coats decorated with garlands of flowers and carried by attendants. Portraits of Nur Jahan from the period suggest that she was wearing a regal turban, much like the ones favored by the emperor and the distinguished nobleman, but highly unusual for a woman. A knee-length tunic with a sash around the waist over tight trousers, and earrings and necklaces of rubies, diamonds, and pearls. Her shoes were open at the back, exposing the henna designs on her feet. At 42, she was still praised by her contemporaries for her luminous beauty. So local hunters on foot guided the party past fields of barley, peas, and cotton, lush from the recent rains. Along the way, they spotted herds of cattle, goat, blackbuck, and long corkscrew horns. When they reached the forest, the emperor and empress could barely see beyond the dense wall of creepers, bushes and trees, lofty neem, thorny babool, and many others. The hunters showed the empress and her retinue the spot where the tiger was likely to appear, and they waited. Soon, Noor's elephant in the head began groaning and stepping nervously from side to side. The mahout couldn't make it stand still, and Nur Jahan's howdah perched precariously. From his own elephant, Jahangir looked on, silent and focused. Later, he would recall the moment in the Jahangir Nama, the memoirs of Jahangir, a journal he began when he ascended the throne in 1605, that would serve as the public record of his reign. An elephant is not at ease when it smells a tiger and is continually in movement, he wrote, and to hit with a gun from a litter is a very difficult matter. So the tiger emerged from the trees. Nur lifted her musket, aimed between the animal's eyes, and pulled the trigger. Despite the swaying of her elephant, one shot was enough. The tiger fell to the ground, killed instantly. Jahangir was delighted. A woman showing publicly was highly unusual. A woman shooting publicly was even more unusual. A woman shooting with such expertise was unheard of. Image 2, please. I'll say something very quickly about this image because this is a really very important image, and I can speak more in the Q&A. This is from the Rampur Raza Library in Rampur in Uttar Pradesh, and this is drawn by the painter laureate of Jahangir's time, Abul Hasan. Art historians have established that this is drawn at some point between 1612 and 17. The dates are really staggering, whichever spectrum of the dates you go with. 1611, she marries. 1612, if that's the date, then this is pretty phenomenal. 1617, she was already, as I call it, in ascent. So this is very much like a noble that's dressed. What made the art historians understand that this was Nur Jahan, of course, there's huge painterly tradition and language that has gone into it, but the waist is much narrower compared to the noblemen who dress in this way. Also, there's a slight rise on the left-hand side, which is indicative of the breast. And if we went closer to the feet, the henna patterns can be highly are highly noticeable. What is even more distinctive about this painting, and again, I think I can talk quite a lot about the painting, but I'll go on, that she is loading the gun. This is really very, very unusual, not only in the Mughal art historical conventions, but I am made to understand by talking to art historians in the European tradition that they have not come across a sovereign woman loading a musket. There are many things to be said about loading, but I'll just say this much. We can hold off more for the Q&A. Can we go to the second slide, please? This is also a very unusual painting. This is of the scene. It's the depiction of the scene that I was talking to you about. And this is drawn by a Pakistani man called Haji Muhammad Sharif. He drew this painting in 1966. He was he worked in the court of Patiala, and he did one of the earliest revival of the modern Mughal school. So Mughal school, as he was going to teach it to modern practitioners of art. And his major focus, his major subject was Nur Jahan. He did any number of paintings on Nur Jahan. And I was fortunate that after 10 years, I was able to locate his grandson in Pakistan, who now owns the rights to some of these paintings. So this is a scene from that. Noor's, to come back to the scene or my discussion after her shooting, Noor's shooting skill wasn't the only thing that made her highly unusual. She held a position in the empire never before filled by a woman as co-sovereign. For more than a decade and a half, from a few years after their wedding until Jahangir's death in 1627, Nur Jahan ruled along with her husband effectively and prominently, successfully navigating the labyrinth of feudal courtly politics and the male-centered culture of the Mughal world. She issued her own imperial orders, and coins of the realm bore her name along with her husband's. The next slide. So in Islamic thought and practice, the edicts and coins were convincing technical signs of sovereignty. Furthermore, She sat where no other queen had sat before or would after, in the jharokha, the imperial balcony from the palace walls, from which she governed business. Subjects gathered below the jharokha to pray for her health, and getting a look at her was considered auspicious. More important, nobles sometimes presented themselves below the imperial balconies. And I'm quoting the paymaster historian Mutamed Khan, who says, they presented themselves and listened to her dictates. At last, he says, her authority reached such a pass that the king was such only in name. Repeatedly, he gave out that he bestowed the sovereignty on Nur Jahan Begum. Image 4, please. In the jharokha, this is from the Harvard Museum of Art. One of the technical ways in which jharokha is depicted, and it's a classic depiction of jharokha, is that the hand is always on the, on the balcony, as it were. So this is a technical sign in which. A generation earlier, Jahangir's father, Akbar the Great, had ordered all royal women, wives, daughters, and concubines, older women, everybody, to be sequestered behind harem walls. He called them the veiled ones, for the first time in Mughal history. But 3 decades after Akbar's dictates, Nur Jahan was on view in the most male and public of spaces. A new kind of power was on display. Nur Jahan was the only woman ruler in the long dynasty of India's great Mughals. How did she do it in that time and that place? How did the Empress's extraordinary strengths, the Emperor's lamentable weaknesses, the twists and turns of 17th century politics, and the power of their love combine to define a time and culture that ought to have made the reign of Nur Jahan impossible? I first met Nur Jahan when I was a restless 9-year-old girl growing up in Dehradun, India. Here, 150 miles north of Delhi. I loved stories, and my mother had a bag full of wondrous tales for my 2 younger sisters and me. She would dish out selections as she played with us on hot summer afternoons, as she oiled our hair or put us to bed, even when she was tired after a long day of running the household. Though some of my mother's stories were about animals, a parrot who advised its owner, a clever fox that fooled some peasants, most were about unusual women, though I didn't notice that at that time. We heard about the brave Rani of Jhansi, who fought against the British rule. Also, Heer Ranjha, the goddess Parvati, who stood up to her husband, the terrifying Shiva. The dutiful princess at the center of Ramayana, Sita. Mother sang songs based on epics and reminded us to behave more like these amazing women when we got overly mischievous. On weekends, my father, a civil engineer, often listened from the sidelines, hidden behind his newspapers. So one afternoon, my mother and I were sitting on the floor playing Gain Gitta. For those of you who don't know Gain Gitta, it simply involves bouncing a small ball with one hand and moving 5 dice into prescribed arrangements with the other hand while the ball is in the air. Creating, for example, a cave with the left hand and placing 1 dice at a time in it with a slight other hand as the ball bounces up. So it's a game of fine balance and focus. It required concentration. Still, at some point, I grew bored. I want a story, I said to my mother. Now, I can't remember whether or not we finished the game, but she did tell me a story, one that I hadn't heard before, about Nur Jahan, wife of the 17th century Mughal Emperor Jahangir. I'm emphasizing this because that's how the story was presented. My mother called her Maharani, Queen of Queens in Hindi. Though some of the details of that day's story are hazy, what stuck with me was that while Nur ruled the empire alongside her husband, dispensing justice and masterminding daring rescues, she also wrote poetry and designed clothing, gardens, and buildings. Still vivid are the glint in my mother's eye as she spoke, and the spark ignited in me by Nur Jahan's accomplishments and allure. She felt more real to me than the other heroines my mother had spoken about. I turned to my father, seemingly immersed in his reading, but eavesdropping on my mother and my exchange. "I'm Nur Jahan," I declared. "You are Jahangir." He laughed and on many occasions repeated these words to others. So at some point, that fascination with Nur Jahan's story translated into my love for the history of the Mughal world, for Mughal women to be more precise. In time, I became a feminist historian after I'd published 2 books that examined duty, aspiration, and degrees of freedom amongst women in pre-modern and early modern India, both of which challenged conventional notions of what constitutes historical evidence about women's lives. I was invited to write a biography of Nur Jahan. So we know hers is a household name here. She has been the subject of at least 8 movies, several plays, an opera, and numerous historical romances in Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Sindhi, English, and many other languages of the Indian subcontinent. You will find tour guides, custodians of Mughal tombs, and local visitors to many of these sites who delight in telling the legends of Nur Jahan. As I began researching for this book, one of my first tasks was to explore that oral tradition. What exactly the public knows or thinks it knows about the Empress. So I engaged a graduate student assistant in Lahore, Pakistan, once part of the Mughal Empire, who asked 30 men and women ranging in ages from 20 to 35 what they knew about Empress Nur Jahan. The majority responded enthusiastically with a famous legend about how Nur and Jahangir met. So did the comparable number of Indian tourists, tour guides, and history buffs that I interviewed myself in Delhi and Agra. So every retelling of the tale, will you pull up the tour guides? These are people I have interviewed for the last 7 years, the same guys, Wahiullah Rahman. And there's another story of the tour guides, but I just would like to, they wanted very much. They said to me that once my book was published, A, I should name them, and B, wherever I talk, I should show their photos. So here they are. Okay. All right. I need the lights, please. So every retelling of the tale with tour guides and all these people that I'm mentioning was a similar rendition to the version that was actually published in 19th century by a writer and critic, Maulana Muhammad Hussain Azad. And this is what Azad wrote about the story. He writes, in the prime of his youth, Emperor Jahangir, at that time Salim, strolled into a garden. He had just been to the Meena Bazaar, the renowned market in the capital where royalty and nobility wandered among merchants, displaying the curiosities of the world. Jahangir had a pair of invaluable pigeons in his hands. He saw a flower he wanted to pluck, but his hands were not free. Just then a young woman passed by. Asking her to hold on to the pigeons, he turned to pluck the flower. On turning back to the woman, he saw that she had only one pigeon in her hand. He asked about the other. She replied, "Your Highness, it has flown away." "How did that happen?" the astonished prince asked. She stretched her hand, loosened her grip, and let the second pigeon go. "Like this," she said. So the prince was stunned. He lost not only his rare pigeons, but his heart as well. So only 2 of the young Pakistanis knew that Nur had been politically a powerful queen and an accomplished poet. And they too began with the pigeon story that is said to have launched the royal romance. Both in Pakistan and India, the people I talked to generally invoked 2 dates: Nur's birth in 1577 and a marriage in 1611, and explained their importance in a few lines. She was born on the road outside Kandahar in Afghanistan. As her destitute parents made their way from Iran to India, they abandoned her. Then she was restored to them. Jahangir and Nur Jahan met in the Meena Bazaar. He fell in love with her. They married. So popular works about the Empress focus on this imperial story. And Nur's birth on the road is the favorite opening scene of films, plays, novels. Most of them revel in her use of feminine wiles to gain influence in the harem and the court, and nearly all of them end, as did the interviewees' responses, with Nur Jahan's marriage. The modern South Asians embrace the legends of Nur with affection, gusto, and pride. The emphasis on her romance with Jahangir truncates her biography in a way in which it diminishes her. In the popular imagination, Nur's story seems to stop at the very moment when her life's best work began. So between 1614 and 27, the year of Jahangir's death, Nur served as her husband's co-sovereign, a decisive player in courtly and succession politics, and a commanding strategist. She defended her subjects against oppressive landlords and otherwise championed social justice. At the height of her power in the 1610s and 20s, princes and courtiers sought her advice and followed her commands. She had the faith and trust of her husband. In 1626, a year before he died, when Jahangir was taken prisoner by a rebellious nobleman, it was Nur who led her imperial troops to rescue him. Amar Chitra Katha, the next. So Amar Chitra Katha, we all know, a popular comic book series read by children and adults alike, highlights this episode from 1626 about Nur Jahan. The illustration, as you can see, shows her astride a war elephant heading to rescue the captive emperor. But inside, it's a tepid story. There is nothing about this event, which is an incredible event. And you know, again, I'd be happy to talk quite a lot about the event itself. So this brave military and political action is very sketchily drawn. More of the comic is devoted to Nur's romance with Jahangir. Secondary school textbooks also mention her briefly, but they don't discuss her as a leader. So the Mughal family into which Nur married, she was not from the family, as is clear, had a tradition of strong and prominent elder women, assertive royal wives, influential mothers and aunts whose opinions were valued, but no woman had openly and fully taken charge of the empire. It would be many, many years after these early Mughal women that Nur Jahan would shoot into prominence in terms of actual practice of statecraft. Many of her male contemporaries were in awe of Nur Jahan, whom they saw as a person of uncommon political and cultural acumen and a remarkable leader. But in a conservative patriarchy, they had trouble accepting, despite empirical evidence, that she could be both womanly and a sovereign. Some commentators pronounced her cunning and conniving, precisely the way in which authoritative women are described to this day. Thomas Roe, the British ambassador to Jahangir's court, saw Nur as a manipulative and mysterious woman. And here's a citation from him. He says, Jahangir's course is directed by a woman and is now, as it were, shut up by her, so that all justice or care of anything or public affairs either sleeps or depends on her, who is more inaccessible than any goddess or misery of heathen impiety. Of course, there's a lot to be said in this sentence, but let me move on. In the view of Peter Mundy, a merchant with the British East India Company who visited Agra in the 1630s, said Nur was haughty and stomachful, that is stubborn. Europeans like Roe and Mundy seemed specially bewildered by the phenomena of Nur Jahan. She hadn't inherited an empire, such as Queen Elizabeth I of England, crowned 20 years before her birth, nor was she exactly a favorite, the familiar advisor minister figure they knew, a staple of European courts, but this person was always a male. They couldn't quite wrap their minds around a woman's coming to power because of her own talents, but they could understand a wily consort winning the indulgence of a love-blind emperor. Jahangir's marriage to Nur in 1611, the critical moment thought by many to explain her rise, launched a multitude of legends about every phase of Nur's life: her birth, her first marriage, harem life, an alleged early affair with Jahangir when he was a young prince, her meeting and marrying Jahangir, her power over her husband, and so on. The legends soon engulfed the truth, overshadowing her actual personal history. Narrations of the royal romance became more extravagant in the 19th century British colonial histories that were steeped in the Orientalism of the day, embracing exoticized stereotypes of Asia. Next slide. Depraved despots, shockingly sensual harem, against which I wrote my first book, just to put it on the table. Okay, thank you. There's another complication about figures like that. Historians writing in the 1960s and 70s, in fact into the 1990s after a very long gap, strove to cast Nur in a fuller biographical mode as a distinguished queen that would be on par with great rulers such as Elizabeth I or Indira Gandhi. Unfortunately, these studies offered only bullet point synapses of her life, so such as, we know, she issued orders, coins were struck in her name, she designed clothes and gardens and so on. There is no palpable sense of the anger or playfulness we would expect of a living woman. No details about her support of Jahangir, her deep investment in the life of the empire, her political maneuvers and counter-maneuvers, her vulnerability as well as her strengths, or the very human way in which she fought to preserve her husband's and her own sovereign rights. Little in these biographies suggest that royal women played any crucial role in imperial life, let alone that one of them, Nur Jahan, was rewriting history. So even into the 20th century, academics disparaged the legends about Nur as gossip and leaned on love as the explanation for her extraordinary rise, rather than attributing it to her talents. They dismissed Jahangir as a drunk, ineffectual king, interested only in aesthetics, philosophy, and mind-altering subjects, so besotted with alcohol, opium, and Nur Jahan that he handed over the running of his realm to her. Yes, the emperor was a drinker, and he smoked opium. Yes, he was deeply in love with his wife, but that's not why she became a ruler to be reckoned with. A key problem for 20th and 21st century scholars has been that they've had no model for producing a layered social history of the Mughal world. They inherited a widely accepted caricature of a mysterious and unchanging harem that was supposed to represent the sum of Mughal private life. That's why I'm wearing harem pants, by the way. So the more deeply I investigated the life and times of Nur Jahan, and you can learn more about my method in the afterword to my book, although I'll happily talk about this to you, the more clearly I saw the reasons that her rise was intriguingly complex, and that neither the popular legends nor the conventional scholarly works, myself included, fully tell her story, which is why I chose to write the way I wrote. Carefully assessed, however, coming back to the problem of evidence, the unusual sources I've used have yielded details that allow me to offer plausible answers to the two questions that came up again and again. How did she do it? I'm asked each time I teach or give a lecture on Nur Jahan. The same query, actually, that was already familiar 4 centuries ago. The same sense of puzzlement at a woman's supremacy. How did she happen back then, and I want to extend it, and in India? I think that's the question. Many people, students, audiences at my public lectures in the West, many times here, an enthusiastic undergraduate who waited on me at a restaurant in North Carolina, friends in private discussions find it difficult to picture a powerful woman rising in 17th century Muslim dynasty. But the common conception of past times as always more repressive and unenlightened than today is misjudged. 17th century India, the empire that called itself Hindustan, known to the Persians and Arabs as Al-Hind, the land beyond the Indus River, had a surprising openness and diversity of religion and thought despite the weight of patriarchy. During his reign, Akbar forcefully set in place an ethos of coexistence. The highly plural culture of Akbar's India was one in which you could be a Shia or Sunni Muslim and yet marvel at the esoteric messages of Sufi mysticism or Hindu asceticism, question Jesuits about the life of Jesus, or tease a youthful monk about the pleasures of flesh, all of which Nur Jahan did, a Shia Muslim woman, married to a Sunni king who had a Hindu Rajput mother and both Hindu Rajput and Muslim wives and concubines. Of course, not all of Mughal life was benign. Arbitrary rule was accompanied by acts of ferocity that would make subjects shudder with fear. A young Emperor Akbar, for example, dispatched a rebellious foster brother by having him tossed off a building. And in 1573, a year after Akbar had conquered and annexed the Sultanate of Gujarat, he quelled a revolt there and ordered his men to make a minaret out of the heads of 1,000 rebels who had fallen in battle as a warning against further insurrection. But Akbar's general commitment to tolerance enabled the advent of new styles of sovereignty on which Jahangir and Nur would build. Ironically, though Akbar was the first Mughal to sequester women in a grand palace harem, his policies of openness allowed Nur to flourish. The personalities and circumstances of the people close to Nur helped shape her unprecedented rise. She became the ruler she became because of Jahangir's strengths and weaknesses, and yes, his capacious and abiding affection and admiration for his wife. I certainly don't intend to undo this imperial romance. Nur and Jahangir, I believe, earned their love story. But other factors are just as important, perhaps more so. Nur's parents were enlightened nobles who took great pains with their daughter's education, which continued in Jahangir's harem, where elder women guided her and mentored her. Life there was far richer, and its matriarchs were politically more astute than many accounts suggest. Her leadership skills deepened and broadened on the road. Jahangir admired the wandering lifestyle of the first Mughal Babur and emulated it. He believed a sovereign should be constantly on the move throughout his realm, observing, interacting, making notes, taking stock, and Nur traveled with him on most of his journeys between 1611 and 1627. Jahangir's interest and love for the itinerant life meant more liberties for Nur and other women of the Mughal household. They came out of the walled quarters to which they'd been relegated by Akbar and into the open country, where the tented harems of the royal encampments afforded them more freedom of mind and body. So Jahangir's mobility contributed to co-sovereignty, making his wife increasingly responsible for governing, released the emperor from state duties, and freed him to pursue his interest in nature, geography, art, philosophy, though he remained the de jure ruler, and she became the de facto empress and co-sovereign. Thomas Roe, again, King James I's ambassador to the Mughal court, wasn't terribly approving of the arrangement which allowed Nur more power. Here's what he says, and he's following them. A part of the problem is also he follows them as far as Malwa, where the camp is based, and he wants to, get some trading rights. And she keeps his seal overnight. So according to Roe and his journal, of course, he's met and interacted, but according to Jahangir, he's never met him. So there's this very interesting tension in the record. Here's what he says. I'm following this wandering king over mountains and through woods, so strange and unused ways that his own people blaspheme his name and hers, that it is said conducts all his action. I fear he will not stay anywhere where course is directed by a woman. Perhaps it happened because the stars were aligned. In Nur and Jahangir's world, all of human existence was bound up with the movement of planets and other celestial objects. Royalty and common folk alike consulted seers and stars, judging auguries before embarking on journeys, scheduling weddings, naming newborns, and making peace with the end of life. Mystics, dream interpreters, seers, and astrologers shaped Nur's world. According to these oracles, the planetary conjunctions seem to have been on her side from the moment of her birth. And this is where the book begins, actually. Thank you.
Thank you.